Grace Williams, a highly successful CEO of a global tech company, woke up early on a Monday morning, feeling determined. She had a busy day ahead, with meetings scheduled back to back, but she knew there was one small task she had to take care of before diving into her work. As usual, Grace was dressed sharply, her confident stride matching the image of a woman who had worked hard for every ounce of success she had earned. Today, she planned to make a withdrawal from her personal account at the local branch of her bank, something she'd done countless times without any issues. She stepped into the bank, greeted by the usual hustle and bustle of the morning. The tellers were busy at their stations, assisting clients who had already started their daily banking routines. Grace walked confidently up to the counter, knowing the process would be quick. But today, it wouldn't be as smooth as she expected. She approached the teller, a middle-aged man who gave her a warm smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How may I assist you today?" he asked politely. Grace returned the smile, though her voice carried the authority that came from years of managing multimillion-dollar deals. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," she said, her tone calm but firm. She had prepared all the necessary paperwork, as she always did for such transactions. The teller's smile quickly faltered when he glanced at the withdrawal slip. His eyes moved to the amount she was requesting, and the nervousness in his expression was impossible to miss. One moment, please," he stammered. He turned to his computer screen, his fingers tapping rapidly as he checked the system. Grace stood there, waiting patiently. She had dealt with this before, even in larger, more complicated transactions. But today, something felt off. A few moments later, the teller returned with a somewhat apologetic expression. "I'm afraid I can't process this transaction," he said, his voice uncertain. Grace blinked, confused by the words. "I'm sorry," she asked, trying to understand what he meant. The teller shifted awkwardly. "There seems to be some sort of internal issue," he explained. "We're unable to process large withdrawals at this time." Grace's brow furrowed. "Internal issue? I don't understand. I've made similar withdrawals in the past." Her voice was still calm, but there was a hint of confusion beginning to seep in. The teller nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "I know, ma'am. It's just, well, there's nothing I can do at the moment." Grace felt a small flicker of frustration rising, but she quickly squashed it. She had been in many difficult situations throughout her career, and she knew how to handle herself under pressure. But this was her own bank, and there was no reason why a simple withdrawal should be causing a problem. "Could you get the manager?" she asked, her tone more direct now. The teller, visibly relieved, nodded quickly and went to fetch the manager. Grace waited, glancing around the bank, her mind already racing through possible explanations. She had worked hard to build her company and her personal wealth, and the thought of being denied access to her own funds was almost laughable. But something didn't feel right. She felt the uneasy stirrings of something deeper, a feeling that this was more than just an administrative hiccup. Moments later, the bank manager, a man in his mid-40s, appeared. He looked flustered, but he gave Grace a polite smile. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Thomas, the branch manager. How may I assist you?" His voice was smooth, but there was an underlying tension in his demeanor that Grace didn't miss. She quickly explained the situation, describing how the teller had informed her that the withdrawal couldn't be processed due to an internal issue. Thomas nodded, though the nervousness in his eyes didn't disappear. "I see," he said, his voice still steady. "I'll take a look at the system right away." Grace stood there, waiting for the manager to resolve the issue. She had expected things to move quickly. But as she watched him type away at the computer, she couldn't help but notice that his actions seemed a bit too slow. It was as if he was stalling. After a long silence, Thomas turned to face Grace, his expression slightly more uncomfortable now. I'm afraid that we can't process this request either, he said. Grace's patience, already tested, began to wear thin. And why is that? She asked, her voice calm but edged with authority. Thomas shifted on his feet, his gaze flicking to the teller before returning to Grace. The amount you're requesting is quite large, he began, his voice laced with uncertainty. It's against bank policy to authorize such transactions without special approval. Grace's confusion grew, but now, there was something else rising inside her. The way Thomas spoke, the hesitations, the way he seemed to be avoiding looking directly at her, it felt off. I'm the CEO of a major corporation. I've held an account here for years, she replied, keeping her voice steady but with a firmness that could no longer be ignored. I don't need special approval. I'm the account holder, and I'm asking for my own money. Thomas hesitated again, looking flustered as he tried to find the right words. Yes, ma'am. I understand, he said slowly, but, you understand, there are procedures in place. He trailed off, as if waiting for Grace to accept his vague excuse. She could tell that he wasn't really listening to her, but rather was trying to find a way out of a situation that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for both of them. Her mind raced as she processed what was happening. Something wasn't right. Grace had always believed in professionalism, in making things work smoothly, but this situation felt personal. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed clear that there was an underlying issue here that went beyond just a bank policy. She had been in the business world long enough to recognize subtle signs of prejudice. And now, it was becoming painfully clear. The realization hit her hard. The manager wasn't questioning the validity of her request due to bank policy, he was questioning it because she was a black woman. This was the type of thing Grace had worked so hard to overcome throughout her life, and now, here it was again, in the form of a simple bank transaction. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just bad service. It was a bias that she could no longer ignore. Grace took a deep breath, her mind sharp and clear despite the growing anger inside her. She had dealt with much worse in her life. She had fought for everything she had achieved. And now, she would fight again, not with anger, but with the same level-headed resolve that had gotten her to the top. Grace stood in the middle of the bank, trying to keep her composure. The manager, Thomas, still seemed flustered. He hadn't offered any clear solution or explanation for why her withdrawal was being denied. Grace, always the professional, decided not to let her growing frustration show, but inside, she was boiling. She had worked hard for everything she had, and now, at her own bank, she was being treated like a second-class citizen. She glanced at Thomas and saw him shift nervously, his fingers tapping against the edge of the desk. He still hadn't made any attempt to resolve the situation or even offer a reasonable explanation. Grace wasn't used to this kind of treatment, especially not in a place she trusted with her finances. But she knew this wasn't the time to lose her temper. She had dealt with enough challenges in her life to know that staying calm and composed was the best way to handle this. She had to think clearly. Thomas, she began, her voice steady and controlled, I'm sure this can be sorted out quickly. I've made similar withdrawals many times before without any issues. Can you explain to me why this is different? She didn't want to come across as confrontational, but she needed answers, and she needed them fast. Thomas seemed to struggle with his words, looking down at the counter as if searching for something to say. He finally spoke, but his words were hesitant. Well, it's not really something I can approve on my own. I would need to get approval from the regional office for such a large withdrawal. Grace raised an eyebrow, still trying to keep her voice calm but now starting to lose patience. Approval from the regional office, she asked. Why would that be necessary? I'm the account holder, and I'm making a request to access my own money. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, not meeting her gaze. Grace could tell he was trying to buy time, but for what? Was he waiting for someone else to step in? Was there something more going on that he wasn't telling her? Her gut told her this wasn't just about bank procedures, it felt personal. And that realization stung. Is there someone else I can speak to? Grace asked, her voice now more direct. She wasn't going to accept vague excuses. She had worked far too hard for far too long to let this slide. Thomas looked at her, his face reddening slightly. He nodded, but Grace could see that he didn't want to escalate the situation. I'll call my supervisor, he said, his voice almost apologetic. Grace nodded, still trying to maintain her professional demeanor, but her mind was racing. What was going on here? Why was she being treated this way? She had been to this bank many times, and never once had she been met with such resistance. Thomas picked up the phone and dialed the number to the regional manager's office. Grace watched him, her arms crossed, waiting for him to finish the call. She glanced around the bank, observing the other customers who were going about their business. None of them seemed to be experiencing the same kind of delays. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Was this really happening? Was she being discriminated against right in front of her? A few minutes passed before Thomas finally hung up the phone. He looked at Grace with an apologetic expression. I'm afraid my supervisor isn't available right now, he said, his voice sounding even more uncertain. But I can try to contact someone else who might be able to help. Grace couldn't help but feel a twinge of disbelief. This was a simple request, and yet she was being forced to jump through hoops. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on taking charge of her own destiny. But right now, she felt powerless, as if she was being held up by bureaucracy and a system that didn't seem to respect her. I don't think I should have to wait for someone else to approve what is rightfully mine, she said, her voice firm but measured. This is my account, and I am entitled to access my own funds. You should have everything you need to process this withdrawal right now. Thomas nodded slowly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I understand, ma'am, he said. But these are the rules. There's not much I can do about it. Grace took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't let this slide. This wasn't just a matter of one small transaction, this was about standing up for her rights and demanding respect. She had built her company from the ground up, and she wouldn't let anyone, especially not a bank employee, treat her like she didn't belong. She had seen firsthand how people like her, women of color, were often overlooked or dismissed in the business world, but she wasn't going to let that happen today. I've had enough of these excuses, Grace said, her voice growing slightly sharper. I'm going to speak with the person in charge. If this isn't resolved immediately, I'll take this matter to the highest level. Thomas seemed taken aback by her response, but he quickly nodded, clearly realizing that Grace wasn't going to back down. I'll try to get in touch with the regional office again, he said, his voice wavering. Grace felt her frustration rise. Why was it so hard to get simple answers? Why was she being treated like this? She stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching as Thomas fumbled with the phone again. In the back of her mind, Grace could feel her patience wearing thin. This wasn't how a professional institution should treat its clients. It wasn't just about the money, it was about respect, about dignity, and about the principle that every person should be treated fairly, no matter who they were. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Thomas put down the phone and looked at her with a defeated expression. I'm sorry, ma'am, but it looks like there's nothing I can do, he said, his voice resigned. I'll have to ask you to come back another time when the supervisor is available. Grace's eyes narrowed as she stared at him. This wasn't just a simple mistake or a case of poor customer service. This was something deeper, something that went beyond bad luck or poor management. She had been patient, she had tried to remain calm, but now it was time to take control of the situation. I don't think I'll be coming back, she said coolly. In fact, I'm going to make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else. Your bank has just lost a client. And I will be sure to make sure the situation is addressed immediately. Thomas looked at her, his expression a mixture of shock and regret. But Grace didn't care about his feelings. She wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. With that, she turned on her heel and walked out of the bank, her mind already set on what she needed to do next. This was far from over. As Grace left the bank, her mind was still racing. She was disappointed, but not surprised. She had encountered countless challenges throughout her career, especially as a black woman in the corporate world, but this incident felt different. The way she had been treated at her own bank, the dismissive attitude from Thomas, the reluctance to process a simple withdrawal, everything about it felt wrong. She had come to expect professionalism from the institutions she worked with, but today, that professionalism had been absent. She walked briskly to her car, her heels clicking on the pavement, her thoughts spinning in multiple directions. How could a simple request be met with so much resistance? Why had she been treated this way? Was it simply an oversight, or was there something more insidious at play? Grace didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let this go. This wasn't just about the money, it was about respect, fairness, and holding people accountable for their actions. As she got into her car, she called her assistant, Maya. Maya, I need you to look into something for me, Grace said, her voice steady but firm. Maya, always quick on her feet, replied instantly, of course, Grace. What's going on? Grace took a deep breath before explaining the situation: the denial of her withdrawal, the bank manager's strange behavior, and the way she had been treated like her request was out of the ordinary. I want you to pull up the bank's records, especially anything related to my accounts, and see if there's any unusual activity or discrepancies. I'm going to need all the information I can get, Grace continued. Maya hesitated for a moment, then replied, I'll get on it right away, Grace. You know I'll handle it. Grace ended the call and started the car, the engine purring to life as she drove away from the bank. She had a full day ahead, but the events of this morning weighed heavily on her mind. She knew that it was crucial to act swiftly. If this was a case of bias or discrimination, she needed to address it immediately. She couldn't let it slide. She had spent years working to break down barriers for people like her, and she wasn't about to let one bad experience undo all the progress she had made. Over the next few hours, Grace kept herself busy with meetings, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the bank incident. She was a woman of action, and while she understood the importance of taking time to process things, this situation wasn't going to be resolved with patience alone. She needed to take control. At lunchtime, she sat at her desk, reviewing the reports from her morning meetings. As her assistant promised, Maya had already gathered information about the bank. There were no signs of unusual activity in her account, but what caught Grace's attention was something more subtle. Maya had uncovered a pattern of behavior from the bank's management that seemed troubling. According to internal communications, some higher UPS had been involved in questioning large transactions made by clients, particularly clients who were women or people of color. The more Grace read, the more she realized that this wasn't just a simple mistake. The way Thomas had treated her was part of a larger issue. Grace had known for years that certain biases existed in the corporate world, but seeing it laid out in such a clear way was both frustrating and eye-opening. The thought that she was being subjected to this kind of treatment simply because of who she was hard to stomach. She leaned back in her chair, her mind working quickly. She needed to speak with someone in charge, someone who could actually make changes. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation. If the bank's management had allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked, it meant there was a deeper issue at play. Grace wasn't about to let that slide. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for the bank's regional office. The call was answered quickly by a woman named Carla, who introduced herself as the regional manager. "Carla, this is Grace Williams," Grace said, her voice clear and assertive. "I need to speak to someone in charge. What happened at your branch this morning was unacceptable, and I need it addressed immediately." Carla's tone shifted immediately upon hearing Grace's name. She recognized it right away. "Of course, Miss Williams. I'm terribly sorry to hear about your experience. I'll escalate this matter to the highest level immediately." Grace could hear the urgency in Carla's voice, but she wasn't satisfied with just an apology. She needed more than that. "I don't want an apology," Grace replied firmly. "I want answers. And I want this situation resolved. I need to know why I was treated the way I was, and I need to know what steps you're going to take to ensure this doesn't happen again, especially to someone else." Carla hesitated for a moment before responding. "I understand. I'll review everything and get back to you within the next hour. But I assure you, we take this very seriously." Grace wasn't sure if she completely trusted Carla's reassurances, but for now, she had no choice but to wait. As the call ended, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the bank's management was trying to cover up something deeper. She had seen this kind of behavior before, the way companies would apologize, promise to do better, but fail to make any real changes. She wasn't going to let that happen here. She spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for an important board meeting, but her mind kept drifting back to the bank. As soon as the meeting was over, she would take action. If the bank didn't do the right thing, Grace would take matters into her own hands. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Grace received a call from Carla. "Miss Williams, I've reviewed everything," Carla said, her voice apologetic. "We've found that the bank manager at the branch where you had your issue made an error in judgment. His actions were not in line with our company's values, and we have already taken steps to address it." Grace listened carefully, but she wasn't satisfied with just a vague statement. "What steps are you taking?" she asked, her voice still calm but firm. Carla hesitated again before responding. "We've decided to issue a formal warning to the manager, and he will be undergoing additional training. We're also reviewing our policies to ensure this kind of situation doesn't happen again." Grace took a deep breath, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. She wasn't going to accept a simple warning. The bank needed to do more. She wasn't going to let this issue go unresolved just because they promised to review their policies. "I appreciate your response, Carla, but I don't think that's enough. This kind of behavior goes deeper than just one manager. I want to know what actions your team is taking to make sure this doesn't happen again." Carla was silent for a moment, and Grace could hear her shifting in her seat. "We'll be implementing new diversity and inclusion initiatives to ensure that all of our clients are treated with the respect they deserve," she said, her voice more sincere now. "We'll also be investigating any other instances where clients may have been mistreated." Grace nodded slowly, but she wasn't completely convinced. She knew that change would take time, and she was prepared to hold them accountable. "I'll be keeping a close eye on this, Carla. And I expect to see real change, not just empty promises." As she hung up the phone, Grace knew that this was only the beginning. She had started something, and she wasn't going to stop until she saw the change she wanted. It was a battle worth fighting, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race or gender. Grace sat back in her office, staring out the window at the city below. Her mind was still consumed by the events of the day, the encounter at the bank, and the promises that had been made. But deep down, she knew that promises were easy to make. It was the follow-through that truly mattered. She had spent her career fighting for equity and fair treatment in a world that often tried to push her aside, and this situation at the bank was no different. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about standing up for what was right, for ensuring that no one else would have to face the same discrimination. She needed to take action, but Grace wasn't a woman to rush into decisions without considering all the facts. She needed to think about the bigger picture. She was the CEO of a major company, and her actions had consequences not just for herself, but for the people who worked for her, the people she represented, and the values she upheld. She had always believed in leading by example, and today, more than ever, she had to be the leader her company, and society, needed. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Maya, her assistant. "Grace, I've got some more information for you," Maya said when Grace answered. "I spoke to a few people at the bank. Word is, the manager who treated you poorly has been on thin ice for a while. Apparently, there have been other complaints about his behavior, though nothing serious enough to warrant action until now." Grace's interest peaked. "Go on." Maya continued. "It turns out that the bank's internal diversity reports have been under scrutiny recently. There's been some talk about improving inclusivity, but it seems that the changes have been slow to come. A lot of the senior staff are resistant to anything that might disrupt the status quo. But after what happened today, it's clear they're going to have to do something." Grace leaned forward, her fingers tapping thoughtfully on the desk. "So, it's not just a one-time mistake. There's a bigger issue here." Maya hesitated. "Yes. And there's more. I've also reached out to a few clients who have voiced concerns about similar treatment. A couple of them are willing to go public with their experiences, especially if this becomes a wider issue. They're ready to support you if you decide to take this further." Grace paused for a moment, the weight of what Maya had said sinking in. The situation wasn't as isolated as it first appeared. There were patterns here, and they needed to be addressed, not just for her, but for others who might not have the platform or the resources to speak up. "Maya, keep me updated. I want to know everything. But don't let this blow over. We're going to take this as far as it needs to go." After ending the call, Grace's thoughts began to take shape. She had been wronged, yes, but there was something bigger at play here. The system that allowed this kind of behavior to happen needed to be held accountable. She couldn't let it slide, not when she had the power to make a difference. She drafted a letter, but it wasn't just any letter, it was a call to action. It wasn't just a complaint, it was a statement of intent. Grace made it clear that she would not accept the status quo. She would not stand by and let the system perpetuate discrimination, even in the smallest of actions. She made sure her words were strong but measured, outlining her experience and the changes she expected to see not just in her case, but across the bank as a whole. Grace sent the letter to the bank's headquarters, copying the regional manager, Thomas, and a few other key figures in the organization. She wanted them to know that she wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't looking for an apology, she was looking for change. And she wasn't going to settle for anything less. The response came quickly. Within a few hours, Carla, the regional manager, called her back. "Miss Williams, I've read your letter, and I want to start by apologizing once again for what happened. I understand your frustration, and I want you to know that we take this very seriously. We're going to launch a full internal investigation into your experience and into the larger issues within our bank regarding diversity and inclusion. We'll be working with an external consultant to help us review our practices and make the necessary changes. I'd also like to offer you a formal meeting to discuss how we can make things right." Grace listened to Carla's words, but she wasn't satisfied with just a meeting. "Carla, I appreciate the gesture, but we both know that words aren't enough. I need real, tangible steps. I want to see the bank not only take responsibility but actively work to make sure that this kind of behavior isn't allowed to continue. We're talking about systemic issues here: bias, discrimination, and a culture that needs to change. I'm going to hold you to those promises." Carla agreed, though Grace could tell the woman was nervous. She knew that Grace was not a woman who made idle threats. Grace didn't just talk about change, she made it happen. As the days went by, Grace kept the pressure on the bank. She followed up regularly, insisting on regular updates. She also reached out to her contacts in the media and asked them to look into the issue. If the bank wasn't going to act quickly, she would make sure the public knew about it. Meanwhile, the bank's leadership began to take action, albeit reluctantly. They acknowledged the severity of the issue and agreed to implement immediate changes. They fired the manager who had been involved in her case and issued a public apology, not just to Grace, but to their clients who had been mistreated in the past. They also promised to establish new training programs for all employees, focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But Grace wasn't satisfied with just a few changes at the top. She wanted to make sure that real, lasting change was put in place. She requested to sit in on the board meetings regarding the bank's new policies. She wasn't going to let them sweep this under the rug. Finally, after several weeks of intense pressure, Grace got the results she wanted. The bank, under significant public scrutiny, agreed to a full overhaul of their diversity and inclusion practices. They established new, more rigorous procedures for handling client complaints and committed to increasing the number of women and people of color in leadership positions within the organization. The changes didn't happen overnight, but Grace was proud of what she had achieved. Her actions had made a difference not just for her, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly, for everyone who had faced discrimination. By the end of the ordeal, Grace had done more than resolve an issue with her bank. She had forced an institution to reckon with its biases and to take a hard look at its practices. And she had shown the world that when someone stands up for what's right, real change is possible. Weeks had passed since Grace's confrontation at the bank, but the impact of what had happened still lingered in her mind. The small victory she had achieved didn't just stop with her own personal situation, it had rippled out into something much larger, something she hadn't anticipated. The power of standing up, of demanding accountability, had ignited something in her that she hadn't fully realized until now. It wasn't just about winning one battle, it was about creating change that would affect many. As she sat in her office, looking over the reports of the bank's actions since the incident, Grace felt a sense of satisfaction. The bank had followed through with their promises, but more importantly, they had acknowledged their flaws and were actively working to make sure something like this would never happen again. Their changes weren't perfect, but they were steps in the right direction. And that, to Grace, was the most important part. Still, her mind wandered back to the beginning. The day she had walked into the bank, expecting a simple transaction, and instead had faced the cold reality of how easily biases could surface. It had been a hard lesson, but it was one that she needed to learn. Grace had always known that the world wasn't fair, but until that moment, she hadn't fully understood just how deep those unfair practices could run. Grace had worked hard for her success. She had built her career from the ground up, overcoming obstacles that many others might have given up in the face of. And yet, despite all her achievements, she had been reduced to a mere client in the eyes of a manager who couldn't see beyond his own biases. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it had strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just going to sit back and let things like this happen. She was going to continue pushing for change, whether it was in the corporate world or society at large. She stood up from her desk, her eyes scanning the city skyline beyond her office windows. There was still so much work to do, so many battles to fight. She knew she couldn't change everything overnight, but that didn't matter. Every little step forward, every small victory, mattered. Grace had learned that sometimes, it wasn't the giant leaps that made the difference, it was the quiet persistence, the steady march forward, that led to true progress. Later that afternoon, Grace received a call from Carla, the regional manager at the bank. She could hear the sincerity in Carla's voice as she apologized once again for the way Grace had been treated. Grace listened, but this time, the words didn't sting as much. The apology wasn't just words, it had been followed by action. The bank had made the necessary changes, and they were working to improve their internal policies on diversity and inclusion. Miss Williams, we're committed to ensuring that our clients, regardless of their background, are treated with the respect they deserve, Carla said. We've already implemented new training for all staff, and we're also working on increasing the representation of women and people of color in our leadership teams. Grace nodded as she listened, but her thoughts were already focused on the future. That's a good start, Carla, she said. But I want to make sure this isn't just a temporary fix. You're making changes now, but I'll be keeping an eye on the progress. I want to see this through. Carla assured her that the bank was fully committed to following through, and Grace could hear the genuine intention behind her words. The road to real change was long, but Grace felt a sense of accomplishment knowing she had played a part in pushing that change forward. As she hung up the phone, Grace thought back to the many moments in her life when she had been told that she couldn't succeed. From the early days of her career, when people doubted her abilities, to the numerous challenges she had faced as a black woman in a predominantly white corporate world, she had constantly had to prove herself. She had faced opposition, but each time, she had risen above it, turning every obstacle into an opportunity for growth. But now, she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the people who didn't have the same resources, the same platform, or the same voice that she did. And that made all the difference. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Maya. Grace, I've got some great news. The bank's leadership team wants to meet with you to discuss their plans for further reforms. They've asked if you would be willing to join the advisory board to help them with their diversity and inclusion efforts. Grace smiled as she read the message. She had expected this. It was a logical next step, and one that would allow her to continue making an impact. She quickly replied, agreeing to the meeting and offering to help however she could. Grace knew that being a part of that conversation, guiding the bank in the right direction, was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. She was already thinking about the kind of influence she could have, the kind of policies she could help implement that would make the bank a more inclusive and respectful place for all its clients. Later that week, Grace sat down in a meeting with the bank's top executives. It was a big moment, one that many people would have viewed as a significant opportunity for personal gain. But for Grace, it was just another step in her lifelong mission to break down barriers and open doors for others. She wasn't there to take credit or to seek accolades. She was there to make sure the changes that had been promised were not only put into action but built into the very fabric of the institution. As the meeting went on, Grace shared her vision for what real diversity and inclusion looked like, not just in terms of hiring, but in terms of culture. It's not enough to have a diverse staff, she said firmly. You have to create an environment where people feel seen, heard, and respected. And that starts at the top. Leaders need to model the behavior they expect from their teams. The executives nodded in agreement, clearly receptive to her message. Grace could see that they were genuinely interested in making things right, but she also knew that it would take time. True change rarely happened quickly, but with persistence and the right mindset, it could happen. By the end of the meeting, Grace had secured a seat on the bank's advisory board, and she left with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a CEO, she was now a catalyst for change within a major institution. And though her work was far from over, she knew that this was a critical moment in her journey. The fight for fairness and equality wasn't something she could win alone, but it was a fight worth fighting, one that she would continue to lead with passion, determination, and a deep commitment to creating a world where everyone was treated with the respect they deserved. As Grace walked out of the building, she felt a sense of pride. It wasn't just because of the changes she had made or the victories she had won. It was because she had shown that standing up, speaking out, and pushing for what was right could create a ripple effect that reached far beyond herself. She had proven that one person's actions could make a difference, and that, in the end, was what truly mattered.